Hi, and welcome to Coping During the COVID Crisis. I'm Janet Gross. It was in late 2019 that we first heard about a virus spreading rapidly in China, and health experts from around the world sounded the alarm almost immediately. Of course, we all know what happened from there and how it spread predictably out of control. And from global impact to the personal toll, so many things seem to be out of control. Well, today we're going to talk about decisions made to get control and learn where we learn things along the way. Dr. Roy Salgado from the University of Holy Cross is here to talk about that with us.
Yes, it's incredible to think that we are where we are 2+ years into this. And initially, when we heard about this new virus, this coronavirus coming out of China in late 2019, that leaders from around the world, including leaders here in the United States, the White House and all those under the administration at the time, having to figure out what to do.
Right.
What do we do? This seems like a pretty significant event that is on the verge of happening. And then we all know what happened. They had to make very swift decisions with regard to restricting travel from China and then restricting travel from Europe. And then the restrictions that were implemented with regard to lockdowns, 2 weeks to slow the spread in the United States. These are not easy decisions that were made.
Especially when they were coming like, okay, oh, we might have a case here. Oh, no,
Right.
It was...
And not decisions to be taken lightly.
Yeah.
And so to have leaders figure out, what do we do? Because this is going to impact our country. It's going to impact the world in significant ways. They really had to think swiftly with little information at the time. And so they made their decisions.
They did. And, they can look back and say, okay, this worked well, this didn't. We all learn from everything we did.
Exactly. And so I think that we're going to have an opportunity to kind of reflect upon that, to see what worked well, what didn't work well, and how leaders and citizens alike worked together to get us to where we are today.
Right, because we're having somebody join us in just a minute to talk about that. But I think that any decisions we've all made personally, too, we can learn from them, and we can look back and learn. So I'm interested to hear what they're thinking about. Oh, what was I thinking then? Was I anxious? All the things that we did at home.
It's important to reflect. It's important to reflect so we know in the future how to proceed, right? What did we do that worked? What did we do that did not work? And let's make choices based upon that information for future situations.
Right. Well, when we come back, we'll be talking with Admiral Brett Giroir, part of the White House Coronavirus Task Force from those beginning days of the spreading pandemic. So stay with us.
At the University of Holy Cross, we prepare our students to live a life with purpose. So launch a meaningful career today at the University of Holy Cross, right here in New Orleans, where good people do great things. Registration going on now.
And welcome back. As we continue our conversation on COVID and mental health, we're joined by a special guest today, former Assistant Health Secretary and testing czar under President Trump, Admiral Brett Giroir. He is also a pediatrician. There are a lot of other credentials and accolades and things we can say about you, but because of your New Orleans roots, we got to say, Jesuit grad.
Absolutely. Jesuit, class of 78.
All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us. We're excited to talk to you about this because obviously since the beginning of the pandemic, Roy and I have been talking about mental health and COVID's effects on it in many varieties of ways. And with you here, you were there right at the beginning when all this was, kind of dumping on everyone. Did you guys have the same kind of anxieties and things that the rest of the nation did as medical leaders and governmental leaders?
Well, we certainly did have those anxieties very early on. I mean, in January, my first roles was in my uniform role, and that is rescuing American citizens out of Wuhan and off all the cruise ships and bringing them back. That was a very important mission. Even though it didn't make a big difference in the whole scope of things, getting those Americans back on U.S. soil was very important. But we didn't know very much about the virus, right? We didn't know how it was transmitted. You remember there's a lot of discussions about potentially the mortality rate being as much as 5%. Now, we didn't believe that. We didn't have any medications, any vaccines. So there was a huge amount of stress, and we knew that in addition to the virus issues, we were worried about simple things like the food supply. keeping the energy grid going. Although, the energy grid is dependent on people who know how to operate it, keeping our military ready, because wouldn't this be a time that some nefarious state or a terrorist would want to attack us? So, and we were worried very early on about the emotional health of the country. I think that's why we tried to be transparent, give a lot of information, press conferences every day so people knew what was going on, because a lack of information is always worse than even bad sort of bad news, right? No news always gets people concerned, but people can handle bad news in context. So we were very concerned. And of course, I had an elderly mom who was, living, in Texas. We all have family members. I wasn't so worried about myself, but, my wife had to get groceries, and we had to have water, and I went to work every single day with, you could not go to work with people getting COVID all around. So, I think we shared a lot of the experience that everyone in the country did.
As White House coronavirus task force member, you played an integral part in mitigating the impact of COVID in its initial stages. And my question to you is, upon reflection, what do you think are some of the things that the leadership did well, and the citizenry as well did well, and what are some things that perhaps could have been done differently?
I think there were many sort of inflection points in the response, and some of them is more from an organizational role, like the importance of moving everything to FEMA very early, because FEMA, which is very familiar to people in Louisiana, really is the only federal organization that has the national scope, because they're used to distributing supplies all over the country. They're used to emergencies. Everybody there is an emergency responder. But some of the really important things, I think, were establishing public-private partnerships very early, bringing American industry, whether it's to make ventilators at General Motors or to bring testing in like we did and really spurred that. And of course, on Operation Warp Speed, but it also, making gowns, making masks, doing all the things that really brought the whole power of America. It's not just the federal government. Federal government had a role, but it really is the American industry. The second thing I thought we did well, particularly early on, was, we tried to communicate. We had press conferences just about every day with the president. I didn't know, we normally have a task force meeting in the afternoon, something like 2 or 3 o'clock. If the president was there, he was there. If not, we went right from there, because the vice president always led the task force. We'd go to the Oval Office, brief the president for a few minutes, and we'd go right out on the podium, and we could be there for 30 minutes or 3 hours, and some of them were like that depending on the questions. And it's both a good thing and a bad thing that we were not scripted. It's a good thing because no one told us what to say. I mean, we were really being honest with our best opinions. We never got criticized. I never got criticized for what I said. I never got scripted for what I said. We were really trying to be honest and transparent with the American people. I think those are really good things. There's always things you want to do better, right? There's always things you want to do better. And we learn a lot about that. I think a lot of it is, is to be prepared early. We were semi-prepared for an influenza pandemic. We were not at all prepared for this type of pandemic. And that wasn't a Trump problem or an Obama problem. It was a national problem.
It's a worldwide problem.
It's a worldwide problem. Not having the infrastructure here in the U.S. We were using 2 billion gloves a week. Guess how many we made in the United States? 0. We did not make a single pair of nitrile gloves in the United States. We're using 2 billion a week. So some of that is, you really have to prepare for this in the future. You can't just have a pandemic and think you're going to be ready. We had prepared pretty well for vaccines, so that allowed Operation Warp Speed to be successful. But that didn't happen just on the fly. It happened because the U.S. had been working on that for 10 years. And even the year before, I was in the Oval Office when the president signed an executive order on more preparations for pandemic flu. So we were already pushing that the year earlier, which really helped us when COVID came. But it's a long process.
And that COVID response was a very challenging one at the time. Everyone was beside themselves, not knowing what to expect. It was something unprecedented that no one was expecting. And there are a lot of unintended effects of the response. The lockdowns perhaps led to some things that nobody really had time to even think about what that could look like. As a mental health provider, along with some of my colleagues, we're seeing some of that effect on children, adolescents, and youth. We're seeing the mental health impact that the lockdowns have had and remote learning has had. To your estimation, what are some of the things that the leaders in the community are saying with regard to that short-term and long-term impact from the lockdowns?
We were very concerned about that from moment one, because it wasn't just about controlling the virus. You know, if you want to control the virus, put everybody in their home, lock them up, and don't let them out, right? Because that would control the virus for a while, but we know the horrible consequences of that. We never advised shutting down schools. And we really never advised the kinds of lockdowns that a lot of places had. I mean, we did have 15 days to slow the spread, then 30, but then we had reopening everything right after that. The reason we did that is, quite honestly, we had 12,000 ventilators in the stockpile. I had received requests for 114,000 ventilators during that period. So we really had to dampen things early. But we were very concerned about the emotional health of the country. We had Dr. McCann's Katz, who is the Assistant Secretary in charge of SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Administration, really working on that early. And we've seen the consequences, right? We were starting to get control of drug overdoses. There were over 100,000 during the year of 2020, 100,000 deaths, and that's not counting alcohol. That's just really opioids, methamphetamines, things like heroin. The American Academy of Pediatrics declared it a public health emergency, the mental health status of our children. We've seen, and these are like serious, this is depression, right, suicides, things like that. This is not talking about what I'm very concerned about is, you know, the learning abilities. You take 2 years of learning, particularly out of those who are underserved, and we see that. The people who are well-to-do found a way to keep their kids educated. The underserved didn't have that opportunity, so they were already behind, so they're going to be 2 years behind, and that's very hard to make up during those critical periods of learning. And then the social and emotional welfare of children and adults, and you look at the consequences, the the emotional consequences, the mental health consequences, but you look at data, 68% of Americans had an undesired weight loss or weight gain during that period, and the weight gain was average 27 pounds. The weight loss was almost that in the extreme. That's all due to emotional stress, and leading to eating disorders one way or the other, and that's going to have profound consequences on heart disease, diabetes, cancer. So we were very cognizant, and I just want to congratulate you. I've not seen anything like this nationally about a show that came on so early, really working with the emotional health. You had people not being able to go to their churches in some places, and that's a source of strength, and not having that, which was something we were very worried about very early. And a lot of people in their family had deaths. Right. You lose a loved one during all this. So the bottom line is we were very aware and trying to do everything we could to kind of mitigate that, to try to keep the shutdowns, quote, shutdowns that governors would impose as minimal as possible, keeping the schools open, because particularly early on, children, we knew we would cause more harm by shutting down the schools than good. So, but we're going to be dealing with this for years to come. Right.
That's my question. How long do you think? I mean, we've heard and talked about estimates that we might not know everything for 20 years, the ramifications of this.
Well, speaking about children, we have good data right now that, I'm sure you're very familiar with, that adverse childhood experiences, yes, even early in life could set you up for heart disease or depression, 20 years later. So these are real things, and it's not just some funny emotional thing. These consequences actually change the way your DNA is read in your body. They actually impact the way genes are expressed. So it really sets you up. If you've had very stressful experience, it sort of sets up that pattern. The good news is that as strong as the data are that early childhood experiences can really have long-term consequences, the best news is that showing support on top of that can minimize that. So if you get children in supportive areas with supportive families, church, school, that the consequences of that can go away over time. But if you don't provide that, you've really lit the fuse on a time bomb, and it's going to explode at some point in time.
To that point, one of the things that I think that we can really be proud of is with regard to this show, we have promoted telehealth throughout this process, which is something that was not an active part of people's provision of services or the delivery of services. And so these children that you're referring to that were the recipients of the digital divide, who perhaps did not have the impact that the well-to-do families had. So they had their education interrupted, they had their social support interrupted, all these things, but then they had access to telehealth in a way that perhaps wouldn't have been available prior to this situation. And the governor and everything making the choices to implement these changes so that services can be provided to the community. Louisiana acted really quickly in this.
You were so wise to talk about telehealth, and I think it's been one of the lessons of the pandemic is not just for telemental health services, but for telehealth services. We sort of realized what people should have realized a long time ago. It's hard going to a doctor's office, right? Even if you're in the city, you got to get in traffic. You know, I hate going to the doctor or hospitals, right? They're imposing, you don't know where to go. You know, the smell gets you kind of, you know, I hate smelling alcohol. So people don't want to do that. But if you can get that care in your home, you can get it early before you're really desperately ill. So we learned that people really like that, and it's effective. And it's effective not just for taking care of your diabetes or working on your wounds, but also for emotional support. And I have to think children would even be in a better position for that because, you know, I didn't grow up with devices, right? They grow up with devices, so this is second nature to them. So I do think it's very important, and we learned even for treating of substance use disorders, that telehealth for substance use disorder treatment combined with medications and other support are really very effective. So you were very wise, and I've said many times, and it's not just I'm a homer, is I thought Louisiana handled the pandemic really well, not just from what they did, but how they interacted with us from the federal government. You know, Governor Edwards, John Bell Edwards, you know, I was on call, he probably called me 3 times a week. And we talk about things, and you know, I'd understand where he's coming from, and the public health officials here. And from very early on, you know, there were some governors that kind of tried to play the system, like, I'm not going to tell you exactly what we have, but I want this, that, or, you know, Louisiana, you know, I asked for, like, what's the status of your hospitals? I got spreadsheets 3 times a week, you know, by region, what hospitals had beds, what had ventilators. So it was very easy because when Governor Edwards would say, I need 500 ventilators, I had the data, and I just said, here's 500 ventilators. We need more testing sites. No problem, we got it, because they were very transparent, and it was a great working relationship. And it, you know, it had no idea, you know, I had no idea that John Bell Edwards, I don't know, he was Democrat, Republican, it doesn't matter. We're all working together. And the Vice President and I flew down on Air Force 2 to Baton Rouge, and we, you know, visited the governor, worked with the public health officials. So I felt very good about Louisiana's response. And it was very critical because we don't have a healthy population in Louisiana, right? We have, you know, the consequences of a life well lived, right? We have
good food, good life.
Good food, good life, you know, good things, but that can catch up to you, particularly in COVID. So I do mean this. I think Louisiana has a lot to be proud of in the way their public health officials, their governor, their mayors, and particularly their citizens of Louisiana responded.
You know, one thing that the University of Holy Cross did, since the beginning we've talked about this, but they have provided free telemental health to everybody in Louisiana. And it's,
wow.
And you just call and you set up the screening, and it's been phenomenal.
From day one, we trained all of our graduate students, our master's and doctoral level students, within 2 days. We got the call on March 11th. By March 16th of 2020, they were providing telemental health services to any resident of Louisiana that sought that free of charge. The Maronites of Holy Cross wanted to put that in place for the community as a response, a proactive, preventative measure for the residents of our state.
I've never heard of anything like that in any other part of the country.
Right.
I think you had to be the leader. Some people would do it in July or August, but to do it in March and to be that thoughtful to understand what this was going to be, I mean, it's really remarkable. And I congratulate you. If I would have known about it, I would have given Holy Cross a public health service medal when I was in uniform. But congratulations and thank you. And I just hope you can share that experience because, you know, it's not just a pandemic. People have, you know, life can be a struggle for so many people, and they need that kind of support. And, you know, some people need support continually, but it's also surprised me that just knowing that that there's somebody at the other end if I need it, how comforting and healing that could be, and you obviously provided that.
You know, I want to, before we, end the segment, I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned in the beginning that even though it's had an effect, COVID and all of the restrictions and everything have had an effect on children, it's not the end of it. We can adjust. We can come out of this, maybe not reversing everything, but helping children along the way in the next 15
Children are resilient, right? It's a really miracle of childhood. Their brains are rewiring all the time. And I do want to emphasize this, that children who grew up in this pandemic time are at risk for so many things, right? But those risks could be decreased dramatically by providing the kinds of things that we know that are kind of instinctual, like an understanding family, right? Support groups going, when I mean a support group, going to school is a support group for children, right? They get to talk, interact, play, going to church, reconnecting, with their church family, having somebody who's not a family member, particularly for teenagers. That's one of the things that if there's a close person who's not a family member, but close to the family that they can reach out to, just as sort of that objective piece. All these things can really help children. So I am worried, but I'm optimistic. If we throw up our hands and say everybody's a victim, then nothing's going to happen. Nothing good's going to happen. But if we say, yeah, we went through the worst pandemic in 100 years on so many levels, but we can do this with the kind of support that you're providing from University of Holy Cross, from talking about the emotional issues, giving permission to people to have their feelings, right? You can't control your feelings. You got to deal with them. You got to work with them. You got to heal through them. But you're going to have those feelings, and it's okay, right? And we're going to have to hold hands and support each other.
So we've learned a lot along the way, and we have more to learn. And I guess we just forge through, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Everyone, from kids, parents, doctors, society, government.
And I do personally think also that gumbo has healing powers.
Certainly does.
Whenever I have a bowl of gumbo, it just makes me feel great inside. With some good andouille in there and some really good spiced chicken. So, have a meal around with your family, have some gumbo, talk about the problems you've had, but also the great blessings that we have, and I see a bright future.
Seafood gumbo is good for the soul. That's what they say, right?
I'm not going to argue with you.
And I love the tradition of like red beans and rice. All those traditions that we have here. Well, a lot of them involve food. Obviously, we've all had our little menu here, but I mean, just getting back to that, not forgetting what we've gone through, but using those traditions to heal.
I'm telling you, one of the first things I did when I left Washington was have Monday red beans and rice. Just because Monday's the day, and getting back to that kind of normalcy is important. And having been the official who wrote the physical fitness guidelines for America, I mean, it was a whole group effort, but it was my signature on the bottom of it. I also want to encourage people that physical exercise is great for your mental health too, and that's children and adults. And I don't mean you got to run a marathon. We're talking about walking 30 minutes a day, doing some kind of active things like working in your garden. Okay, grow the melatonin. All right, do that. Move your way is exactly what we said. And I don't want people to forget just a little bit of physical activity helps your emotional health. It helps consolidate your sleep so you sleep better, and it really can change your life. So do a little bit of physical activity. It's one of the best things you could do for yourself.
Admiral Giroir, thank you so much for joining us.
You're so welcome.
We appreciate your knowledge, your insight, and the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your service.
And we'll be back right after this.
Can I tell you a cat joke? Just kidding.
Welcome back. And wow, loved getting the perspective from someone who was there making so many of the decisions and quick calls about what to do. And we all had those calls.
Wow, and it's just incredible to see people at those levels, the White House Coronavirus Task Force having to make those swift decisions early on for the world, in essence.
Everybody.
Everyone, not only the United States, but for the world, because the world does look to the United
Right,
States.
we're a leader. Yeah.
We're leaders, and to see these leaders having to make decisions in a matter of days that impacted 7.9 billion people, the 340 million U.S. citizens, but those abroad too, it impacted everyone, that they did it so quickly, and that we can look back upon it and see there are certain decisions that were made that appeared to have been helpful and that worked, and perhaps there were other things that could have been done differently, but we're human beings, and to see that leaders are human beings. They're everyday people like you and I and those of our viewers that are watching that are put in situations and that for such as times as these are confronted with very challenging tasks, and that even in spite of those challenging tasks, that they can look at it as an opportunity to find solutions as opposed to crumbling under the pressure of a problem.
I also liked, when he was talking about, he already had trust in people. And so he would say, okay, yes, just as he was talking about Louisiana, I see that they've done their work, I trust them. And that's, sped things along. And so in our personal lives, those people we trust, we count on, and we want to be the ones that they can count on.
Absolutely.
So many lessons.
Yes, to trust our leaders at the municipal level, the state level, the federal level, and then within our own little microcosms, for our children to trust us as parents, for we to trust one another as spouses, as members of a family. That trust is important in order to be able to, when presented with opportunities, that we find solutions to them as opposed to crumbling under the pressure of a problem. And I think that's a very important thing that I certainly took away from this conversation with the Admiral.
Me too. Okay, we're running out of time, but one tip. Give us one tip.
In a nutshell, the big takeaway, the big tip is that life presents itself with all sorts of circumstances. There are opportunities to grow and not problems that crush us. So let's go ahead and take these circumstances and grow from them and take them as opportunities.
Right, you don't ever have suffering. Suffering is bad enough, but to have it suffer in vain?
Right.
So use it.
Learn from it.
Yes.
And the pandemic has taught us a lot.
Cool, we've learned a lot of lessons. Okay. Well, thank you, Dr. Roy Salgado, and we certainly want to thank Admiral Brett Giroir for joining us too. And thank you for watching. We want to help as we are all coping during the COVID crisis.